Here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and today we're going to be pushing back on the narrative. And this is actually some good news, and it's not often that I get to share a lot of good news. So I'm in good spirits today, and very happy to have you joining me here on this program, which is designed not to tell you what to think, but to help you more efficiently sort your way through some of the fluff, some of the spin, and definitely some of the smoke screens being put out there by much of our corporate media. By the way, speaking of this, I want to share with you what I consider some of the best hard-won wisdom from over the past 3 years. Now, you probably heard there are some rumblings that, well, masks are coming back and certain COVID restrictions are coming back, and certainly corporate media is doing its part to push a narrative that, hey, everybody, you need to be scared, and there's going to be more restrictions coming, and we're going back to the lockdowns and that sort of thing. Personally, I don't believe that's going to be the case. I think too many of us have hindsight, and we understand that all the king's horses and all the king's men, all the lockdowns, all the distancing, the mandated jabs, the masks, and so forth, still didn't stop everybody from getting the disease and then getting natural immunity. And yes, it was a struggle for some people, primarily those with comorbidities, but the bottom line is there was a lot of lying that was going on. And 3 years ago, in fact, a little more than 3 years ago, I stumbled across a writer by the name of AJK, and her advice on how to spot a media narrative was extremely useful back then to cut through some of the COVID narrative, and it's just as useful today. So I want to share some of that with you in hopes it will be helpful for you. It starts with an observation by a person on X who says there wouldn't have been a pandemic without the media. 99.9% of places didn't have hospitals over capacity any more than in a normal flu season. It really is startling how much legacy media screwed up the world. And I know this may sound harsh, but I agree with this assessment. And even to this day, you still have, media fact checkers and KTVB, no, ivermectin still is not approved. And, they're just doing everything they can to try to hold up a narrative that has fallen apart like a soup sandwich. So here is the advice that AJK had to offer that I found so useful. Notice this is from back in May of 2020. So AJ, as a professional writer, said, look, if you want to listen to the experts, listen to me. I'm an expert in narrative, and there's a 100% media narrative regarding COVID. Now, she explains, narrative is storytelling, and it's different than journalism. Journalism informs, but without judgment. Pull up the latest headline, she says, and look for the adverbs. By the way, this is really good advice. Look for those emotional triggers, the pleas to fear and virtue. Narratives use those elements to engage the reader. Reporting an increase in cases without reference to the significance of the concurrent increase in testing is an example of an engaging narrative, as is the singular focus on COVID as the only threat to our way of life. She says it prioritizes story arc over facts. It follows a plot line, but disguising narrative as journalism is deceptive. She says it's akin to native advertising, in which she says I'm also an expert, but not because I do it professionally, but because I won't. Now, she goes on to talk about a couple other things here that are worth, again, file these away. You may find them useful. When they engage in narrative, when the media engages in narrative or native advertising, it erodes brand trust, it misinforms, it steals the earned attention of consumers. She says this narrative has a similar deceptive angle, except it's far more harmful. It blinds people to the whole of the risks we're facing and weaponizes self-righteousness to silence dissenting ideas. Think about the people who persecuted the maskless. Think about the people who lost their jobs because they didn't take the jab. That's what she's talking about. Figuring out why the media is crafting the narrative, she says, that's not in my wheelhouse. That's up to someone else. But if you insist on listening to experts, she says, listen very closely to me. The media is pushing a narrative. Now, you may think to yourself, well, okay, Brian, she's, obviously a Fox News contributor or some kind of, conservative. She's just pushing something that you happen to agree with. Not so. In fact, she actually, I think, has a very nice disclaimer. This is one of the reasons why I've found her to be such a credible source. ETA, this is not an easy assertion for me to make. AJK says, I have a penchant for comfortable naivete and high evidentiary threshold. I have no political alignment nor covert agenda. What I'm after is the truth. And to admit that this is the truth is profoundly disquieting, which explains why many of us are going through the longest, most drawn out, and unpleasant I told you so that we've likely ever experienced in our lives. Okay, this is one of those cases where it's not so much, yeah, we wanted to be right. Really, life would be a lot more sane and our minds would be a lot more at ease if it turns out that we weren't. But we were. So blowing the whistle on some of this stuff, it's necessary. I'm just urging you, be cautious. If the media starts ramping up the fear, if they start, the fear porn to go along with COVID, pay attention to those adverbs, pay attention to the words that trigger you, make you feel fearful or angry, because chances are somebody's yanking on your chain. Hey, speaking of yanking on someone's chain, I suppose you've heard about this story. If you haven't, I've got a wonderful story to share with you. I just see a young man. This is a young man by the name of Jaden. Don't tread on me. Now, Connor Boyack shares his story in a series of tweets here, but he also brings the receipts. So this isn't just a matter of, somebody's hearsay about what happened to Jaden. Jaden is a student at a charter school in Colorado Springs, Colorado. And on his backpack, which you see him wearing here, he has a number of different patches, one of which is the Gadsden flag, which is the rattlesnake that says, "Don't tread on me." So I'll let Connor tell the story as we move forward here. 12-year-old Jaden, who was kicked out of class yesterday in Colorado Springs for having a Gadsden flag patch, which the school claims has origins with slavery. You didn't know that, did you? The school's director said via email that the patch was disruptive to the classroom environment. Now, under those circumstances, pretty much anything could be. But the school actually cited the EEOC, yes, the federal EEOC, which admitted the flag originated in the Revolutionary War in a non-racial context. But they then said, however, whatever the historic origins and meaning of the symbol, it has also since been sometimes interpreted to convey racially tinged messages. Do you understand what's happening there? Someone has chosen to interpret it a certain way. Because of that, we can't take a chance of letting this kid have a flag that was around at the birth of this nation. By the way, did you know that flag was designed by Benjamin Franklin to encourage the colonies to stick together? Nevertheless, the director then argued that the flag is associated with hate groups. Linking to this weak article that cites a graphic design scholar who claimed that some may now see the Gadsden flag as a symbol of intolerance and hate, or even racism, which pretty much covers anything that anybody on the left doesn't agree with. Well, it may be intolerance, it may be hate. So the school, in an email sent out to Jaden's parents, said, "We sincerely hope to have Jaden back at school tomorrow to resume his normal school day, but that will require that this patch be removed from his backpack. I've been coordinating with Dr. Michael Claudio, Assistant Superintendent, Personnel Support Services. He understands you may reach out to him regarding this issue." There's his phone number. There's his email. "We're just following procedure." And this is what the teacher was saying as she brings in his parents and says, "This is why we can't have that patch in the classroom. We're just following procedure. This is just protocol. This is just procedure." Click, click, go the heels. But none of it was even based in reality. Connor asks, so what rule was Jaden actually breaking? Well, according to the director, there's a highlight, and we'll show you. This is from the EEOC, although it's unclear what this is from the school district, rather. It's unclear what alleged slavery connections have to do with drugs, tobacco, alcohol, or weapons. Now, the fine print is kind of tough to see here, but they're talking unacceptable items: shorts, dresses, skirts, or other similar clothing shorter than midline length, sunglasses or hats worn inside the building, inappropriately sheer or tight clothing showing off body parts, tank tops or any other similar clothing with straps narrower than 1.5 inches in width, bandanas of any color, good reason, that's typically gang stuff, any clothing, paraphernalia, grooming, jewelry, hair coloring, accessories, or body adornments that are or contain any advertisement, symbols, words, slogans, patches, or pictures that refer to drugs, tobacco, alcohol, or weapons. That's the one they singled out. Here's why we had to pull this young man aside. There's nothing on the Gadsden flag that refers to drugs, tobacco, alcohol, or weapons. You know what it does refer to? is it refers to a willingness to assert and claim and defend one's rights. Now, that some people would jump to violence, I think says more about their mental state than it does about the Gadsden flag. But that's the one that they highlighted. It can't be of a sexual nature. It can't have by virtue of color, trademark, arrangement, whatever, denote membership in a gang. It can't be obscene, profane, vulgar, lewd, or legally libelous, threaten the safety or welfare of any person, or promote any activity prohibited by the student code of conduct. None of those apply to this young man's patch on his backpack. But he still caught a ration of grief over this simply because someone thought, well, it may be, it's disruptive to the environment. Now, I do have to tell you this. Connor Boyack is the author of the Tuttle Twins series of books, which actually teach kids free market principles, teach them the basic precepts of liberty, and actually, there's a lot of really great stuff. It's the basic principles of freedom. And yes, Jaden is a Tuttle Twins reader, which explains why this particular meme came about. That face when you tread on a Tuttle Twins reader for wearing a "Don't Tread on Me" patch. That's his teacher sitting there in the background with that sour look on her face. Now, of course, this is something that's taken pretty seriously, and actually the Vanguard School where he attends realized after they told him, don't come back to school with that on your backpack. Well, he did come back the next day. And he had to sit by himself, as they tried to sort out what do we do. They saw the light. Probably had no choice. The optics on this were not looking good for the school. And so they said, upon learning of these events today, the Vanguard School Board of Directors called an emergency meeting. Oh, crap. How do we spin this in our favor? Thankfully, I don't think they spun it so much as they just realized, you know what? We need to back down from this one. And they did. From Vanguard's founding, we've proudly supported our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the ordered liberty that all Americans have enjoyed for almost 250 years. The Vanguard School recognizes the historical significance of the Gadsden flag and its place in history. This incident is occasion for us to reaffirm our deep commitment to a classical education in support of these American principles. At this time, the Vanguard School Board and the district have informed the student's family that he may attend school with the Gadsden flag patch visible on his backpack. I got to give him credit. Okay, they didn't dig in and, hire lawyers and, well, they're going to fight this thing out. And, it didn't end up going to the Supreme Court. They recognized, you know what? We're making a big deal out of nothing. But isn't that kind of the norm? Isn't that how things are done these days? We make a big deal out of nothing. I mean, for crying out loud, it's not like this kid was doing anything, wrong. So there's the Gadsden flag. If you didn't know what we were talking about, there it is. James Lindsay says, whether the Gadsden flag is racist or not, that's not the issue. The ability for the American people to unite behind a symbol of the country, that's the issue. To sublate the flag into a symbol of the enemies of the people, meaning those who support the Democrats, that's the issue. Now, thankfully, this has also spawned some people to have a pretty decent sense of humor about the whole thing. Let's see, the Babylon Bee, FBI seizes Jaden's backpack in pre-dawn raid. It's funny, but like most good satire, there is a kernel of truth in there that at least makes most of us kind of stop and go, ooh, ow. Yeah, there's this mugshot, thanks to Fulton County. Jaden looking pretty good, rocking the tri-corner hat. And I wanted you to see this too, just because talk about mixed messages. Okay, there's Jaden with his backpack. Down there in the lower right corner of his backpack, you can see there's the Gadsden flag. This is his teacher's car. Now, it's hard to read all those bumper stickers, but his teacher is very much in tune with the climate crisis and renewable energy and, hey, man, go green, save the earth. And talk about, a billboard of environmental issues. It's not so much a matter of, well, if he just was expressing these points of view that fall within what is considered acceptable by the faculty or by the administration, he'd be fine. Now, I have a theory. Maybe I'm wrong on this, but I'm going to float it out there anyway, just for the sake of argument. I think the problem with the Gadsden flag, at least on the part of administrators and other people who come from that controlling left-wing worldview, the one that needs to control other people. Yes, there may be people on the right who feel the same way, but right now, if you want to see what it looks like, it's the left that's pushing it the hardest. People on the right typically just want to be left alone. And the Gadsden flag establishes that don't tread on me. Don't deny my rights. Don't force your way into my life. Don't coerce me. Or as the snake implies, you will get bitten. So yeah, there is an implied consequence if someone is to ignore that warning of don't tread on me. But it's also very much within the natural order of things. Rattlesnakes don't go out looking to start fights with people. They'll leave you alone until you tread on them, back them into a corner, or otherwise make it where they feel like, hey, I've got to defend myself. And so it is with citizens and their rights. And I think the reason that this is so offensive to those with a controlling nature is because it is a very direct reference to your powers have limits. They don't like that. They do not want to be reminded that to the people absolutely retain the right to say no and back it with force if necessary. If you're gonna push it hard enough, you may find yourself on the receiving end of what the King of England was on the receiving end of when he tried to force the issue with the colonists. Now, thankfully, it hasn't come to that for almost 250 years. But that's still part of securing your natural rights. And I think that's what offends those of a controlling nature. So for what it's worth, that's my theory. All right, this was a pleasant surprise. Chuck Malloy, I think I've disagreed with most of the commentaries that I've seen him write. This one, I have to say, I really appreciated what he had to say here. This was published in today's Times News, magicvalley.com. Actually, it was a couple days ago, sorry. If you're not an extremist, you must be a rhino. I was talking about the labels and the name calling that are so prevalent right now, but particularly as they apply to politics here in Idaho. I think you'll appreciate what he has to say. Chuck says, when Republican Senator Tammy Nichols of Middleton reads the words far-right extremist in a political commentary, she knows that the side she generally represents won the debate. She told Chuck, they've already lost the argument, so it's not worth my time to bring any kind of logical conversation into the discussion. The writers are going from trying to have a conversation to getting personal about it. And that's true. Labels are usually used in place of logic because, okay, I'm out of things to say, so now I'm just going to go on the ad hominem attack and say bad things about you. Now, Chuck says she has a point. Influence peddlers who employ labels essentially are speaking to the choir, those who agree that those far-right extremists are a menace to society. But he says the name-calling mostly does nothing to sway people on the right. Isn't that interesting? I wonder why they do it then. Is it just to antagonize? Nichols said, I call it label lynching. It's when they disagree with you but don't have a solid argument, so they label you. It was a tactic used during the times of Karl Marx or Nazi Germany when they attacked the Jews. When I hear that far-right extremist and it's directed at me, she says it reinforces to me that I'm on the right track. She has a point there too. Just read the latest Jim Jones commentary and you'll see anything he's calling extremist probably means that's where people are actually having impact. Now, Tammy Nichols says what we've learned is that the name-calling and bullying we heard on the school playground has not ended. People grow up, but they bring some of the names with them. And that I'm happy to see somebody actually come out and say that, even though I'm guilty of using labels myself sometimes. It's a habit I have tried to wean myself away from because it really adds nothing to the discourse. But yeah, it's schoolyard tactics. Now, Chuck says there's nothing new about name-calling in politics from the conservative side of the fence. Any Republican that doesn't score high on the Idaho Freedom Foundation Index is labeled a rhino. Former President Donald Trump, the pride of the GOP, has turned name-calling into an art form. All right, fair enough. He's got a point. He says, during my early days of political reporting in Idaho, writers often used the term ultra-conservative to arbitrarily describe those who were perceived to be to the right or far right of center. Of course, that term applied only to Republicans. Democrats were never branded as ultra-liberals or liberals in general, which is also, again, I think that he's dead on, and I appreciate Chuck Malloy showing that. It does show that there's kind of an interesting double standard. Now, Nichols says, when someone calls me a far-right extremist, I throw back the question, what does that mean? And they can't define it. Is a far-right extremist someone who upholds the Constitution, believes in limited government, or stands up for people's rights? She says those are things I stand for, so I don't accept the label, which is another great thing to consider. Just because someone throws a label at you doesn't mean you have to accept it. Okay, I guess that's what I am. No, you can just let it bounce right off and, sorry, I don't believe in word magic, but, you knock yourself out. Now, in the Idaho Statesman recently, an editorial suggested that far-right extremists ran off a Post Falls educator, Karen Lauritsen, who was selected as Idaho's Teacher of the Year. We actually covered this on this program just a few days ago. The teacher apparently had friendly views toward the LGBT community. That's soft pedaling it, but yes. She also had similar friendly views towards Black Lives Matter, transgender rights, and the United Nations agenda. She was a good advocate for all of those causes. Well, Chuck Malloy says, not surprisingly, Nichols had a different view than the Statesman's editorial board, saying they used the term far-right extremists, but they didn't label the teacher as anything for pushing a radical agenda. She wasn't labeled as a far-left extremist, but they tell you about these right-wing extremists without telling you who they are or why they are extremists. If the teacher doesn't fit in with Idaho, then I say good riddance. But if those concerns are not just in Idaho, she says there are plenty of parents everywhere who are riled up with the LGBTQ and transgender agenda pushes that are happening in education. And I don't want to say I told you so, but that sounds very similar to something I was saying just a couple of weeks ago and talking about that teacher leaving the state of Idaho. Normal people have a problem with this being proselytized to their kids. Now, Chuck Malloy says the Statesman probably has its own idea about what's radical in the political world, but it's probably closer to mainstream within the Idaho Republican Party, which largely has been taken over by conservatives. That transformation has been by design. In Nichols' view, conservatives worked hard on the grassroots levels of the GOP, while the so-called establishment was asleep at the wheel. The efforts resulted in former Representative Dorothy Moon taking over as party chair, and former congressional candidate Brian Smith of Idaho Falls moving in as national committeeman. Now, he wraps it up by pointing out the establishment wants to maintain the status quo, according to Nichols, but that's been what's causing the demise in some states. She says Colorado's an example of what can happen in a few short years. People were not engaged and not on the ground educating voters, getting people to run for office, taking stances and being vocal. Those that are doing this are being labeled as right-wing extremists. Now, Chuck says those extremists might be an election or two from being the undisputed mainstream in Idaho. Editorial and column writers might want to think about visiting some school playgrounds for some fresh name-calling material. Now, again, Chuck and I have probably not seen eye to eye on very many things, but he does have a good point. And if we find ourselves using labels, it's probably a good chance to step back and say, okay, when did I run out of substance that now I have to resort to name-calling? That's almost always going to be the case. But there's also the case of when you're reading news stories, and particularly headlines. Watch those headlines. If the headlines use labels, if they use judgment-laden words, this goes back to AJK's advice, then what you're being given is not necessarily journalism. It's most likely narrative. And there's a world of difference between journalism and narrative, but it's on you and me to figure out which is which and not get snookered into believing things that are maybe only half true or maybe even completely false. I know it was easier when people just tell us the truth and we could just, assess the facts for ourselves. We still have to assess the facts for ourselves, but it's just a little bit tougher because right now there are some very skillful people who are paid to spin the truth and try to make it look like something that it isn't. It's, sophistry, it's, craftiness. Sometimes it's just, deception. But if you're not doing your part to try to figure out which is which, there's a really good chance that you're going to be misled on certain issues. And, if nothing else, look at this kid, this Jaden with his tri-corner hat and his Gadsden flag. That's a perfect example of a young man who at a very early age is learning how to think. Not just what to think, but how to think. Do you think it was uncomfortable for him to stand up and assert, I want to keep this patch on my backpack? I bet it was. But it was the right thing to do. And he and his mom actually approached local TV station there in Colorado Springs and said, hey, I'm being kicked out of my class because of this. The TV station declined. Can you imagine if he had said, I'm being kicked out of my class because I want to wear my transgender patch and I want to, represent, I want to wave the rainbow flag. Do you suppose they probably would have been all over that? I mean, we can't know for sure, right? I'm not a fortune teller, but given the direction that sympathies tend to run, I tend to believe that, I think the media would have been all over that and trumpeting it, every opportunity they had. Well, thankfully we have alternatives, this program being one of them. Thanks again for joining us. Again, use care, use your brain. God gave you a brain. Use it to figure out what's true and what isn't. Do not take anything at face value if it's coming to you from mass media. That means you don't have to believe me either if you don't want to. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see.
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.